Good afternoon. Welcome to Where Have You Gone, Davy Crockett? And I hope you're in the right place. I'm sure you are. It's going to be wonderful. We're going to hear from Jack Chambliss this afternoon. Jack is an economic professor at Valencia Community College. He regularly speaks around the country on economics of liberty. He's written for the Wall Street Journal and many other publications and has even appeared on Fox News. And he is also a homeschool father of two. So please give a round of applause for Jack Chambliss.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate you being here right before dinner. My wife suggested for this talk that I wear a coonskin cap to make the presentation more interesting, but I hope you'll find it interesting, even though I did not honor her wardrobe suggestion. For those of you who are going to be here tomorrow at 11 a.m., I'm giving a talk entitled, Is Socialism America's Destiny? It will be a more extensive examination of some of the things that are going on in this country, and tonight's presentation will also show up to a smaller degree tomorrow, but tonight we're covering probably what may be the biggest source of concern that free market, capitalist, liberty-loving economists have about the direction our country is headed. This morning, while preparing a homework assignment for my 11-year-old son, I came across this quote by Justice Louis Brandeis from a 1928 Supreme Court case where Mr. Brandeis said, "Experience should teach us to be most on guard to protect liberty when the government's purposes are beneficial. Men born to freedom are naturally alert to repel invasion of their liberty by evil-minded rulers. The greater dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but without understanding." And I think that covers a lot of what we're about to do over the next hour. And I will offer some sort of an apology to begin. I'm going to use a lot of quotes tonight from various founders and other folks. Since I didn't invent anything that you're going to hear tonight, the best I can do is borrow from the work of geniuses and try to put it together in a package that you can go home and teach your children to value liberty and constitutional law. As I mentioned before, I think government spending poses the greatest threat to the long-run liberty of the United States of America. The current national debt is $13 trillion, which is about 90% of our gross domestic product. But for those of you who pay really close attention to things, you probably have heard that the unfunded liability of Medicare and Social Security going forward over the next 75 years puts the actual national debt closer to $100 trillion. Money that many of us in this room will not be asked to come up with, but that our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be asked to come up with. I get asked often, how did we go from a nation where during the latter part of the 1700s, all of the 1800s, and the first third of the 1900s, the federal government cost the average American citizen about $20 a year in taxes, to a nation where today it costs the average American over $10,000 a year in taxes. Well, first of all, when the founders met in Philadelphia in 1787 to craft our Constitution, a discussion came about, of course, as to what the proper role of government was to be with respect to spending. And you see, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution, it says, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Number 1, to pay the debts. Number 2, provide for the common defense. And number 3, to provide for the general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States." The first two are pretty easy. We went into debt to France principally during the Revolutionary War, so the founders felt that taxes, not income taxes, all taxes were supposed to be voluntary, primarily sales taxes, that our taxes could be used to pay down the debts because many of the founders believed that England would show up again and we were going to have to borrow money again. So they said, okay, when the people pay taxes, we are going to give ourselves the authority to pay down the federal debt in protection of life, liberty, and property when those taxes are collected. To provide for the common defense, that's an easy one. It gets tricky when we get to this idea of the general welfare. When I broached this phrase, general welfare, with my college students and asked them, what do you think the founders meant by this? Many of them say, well, are we supposed to get welfare checks generally? And I say, no, that was not supposed to be the case at all. I tell them, if I came into this room today and said that I've decided to do something for the general welfare of the class, it means the well-being of everyone equally, not specific welfare for one particular student to the detriment of someone else. So, the founders, to make things crystal clear, in Clause 2 through 18, this is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, I encourage you with your students at home to have them open up the Constitution and go through Clause 2 through 18. The founders enumerated, numbered exactly what was covered under the General Welfare Clause. And they thought that they had a clear understanding of what government going forward was going to be allowed to do. One of the founders disagreed with the enumerated clauses, these very specific guidelines on what the General Welfare Clause meant. His name was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, during the Constitutional Convention, and you remember Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury, trusted aide of George Washington, brilliant young man. Hamilton stood on the floor of the convention and gave a 5-hour speech. And this man, who many of you know wanted the president to be appointed for life, did not believe in states' rights, who was a carryover of British monarchy, Hamilton argued that the enumerated clauses were flawed and that government should be allowed to spend money on anything it wanted to spend money on, so long as it could be argued that it was for the general welfare of the United States. It is important to note that not one other founder that day seconded his motion to give government broad authority to interpret the General Welfare Clause however it saw fit, without regard to Clause 2 through 18. Not one other founder agreed with Hamilton that day. He left very angry, historians will recall, rarely to return to the convention. Hamilton returned to the picture in the United States of America in 1935. We'll get back to that in just a moment. Some of your students might ask, why did the founders disagree with Alexander Hamilton? Why did you have one guy who, and many of my students, and those people who buy into the theory of the living document, that our Constitution should change with the times, many of my students look at this and say, you know, what if maybe Hamilton was right? I mean, there's no way all these guys could have seen in 1787 what might be going on in 2008. They couldn't have envisioned a housing crisis and healthcare being the biggest problem they couldn't envision global warming. They couldn't envision any of these things. So maybe Hamilton was one of these rare geniuses who got it and the rest of them did not. So maybe it would have been better to honor Hamilton then. Well, I'd like to share with you some of the thoughts from the other founders as to why they did not agree with Hamilton. Sarah, the second one, please. James Madison. With respect to the words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of powers connected with them. To take them in a literal and unlimited sense would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. So for Madison, he was concerned that to move away from the enumerated clauses and have a broad definition of general welfare, that future governments would allow themselves to spend money on whatever they wanted to spend it on, and that the Constitution would metamorphosize into something that they did not. In other words, you would have an unlimited capacity to spend, and therefore an unlimited capacity to tax private property for that spending. James Madison also, Thomas Jefferson. If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, The government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions. Finally, Ben Franklin, my favorite quote, "When the people find that they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic." They knew why Hamilton was wrong. Going back to John Locke in 1690, think about how long it took. We had to get to 1690 A.D. for someone to write that God gave us the right to life, liberty, and property. And took 86 years for the founders to have the courage to write a Declaration of Independence based on the idea that we have a God-given right to life, liberty, and property. To write a rule book when you've lived through tyranny is to probably understand how to avoid tyranny in the future. And tyranny in the future, according to the founders with the exception of Hamilton, meant confining government's ability to spend the taxpayers' money. In 1794, James Madison, in one of the most important quotes for today, in 1794, when Congress appropriated $15,000 for relief of French refugees who fled from insurrection in San Domingo to Baltimore and Philadelphia, James Madison stood on the floor of the House to object, saying, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents." Now, this is one I encourage you to make a homeschool lesson out of, and ask your children, what is benevolence? If they know, they'll tell you. If they don't, you can tell them. And then ask them, why do you suppose James Madison, the author of the Constitution, why do you suppose he said that there's not one penny that can be used in the name of benevolence from Congress? Well, I'd like for you to consider, first of all, that charity is a voluntary act. Government, by its definition, cannot engage in charity, because every government giving begins with a government taking. That immediately eliminates the idea of government being a charitable organization. Davy Crockett had to learn this lesson the hard way. David Crockett, a member of the House of Representatives from 1827 to 1831, towards the end of his term in Congress, Congress was taking up a vote on whether to give money to the wife of a deceased naval officer. And many of them stood on the floor and spoke of all of the wonderful things this naval officer had done for the country, and that it was a debt to this lady that we do this for her. Davy Crockett stood on the floor of the House and said, "Mr. Speaker, I have as much respect for the memory of the deceased and as much sympathy for the sufferings of the living, if suffering there be, as any man in this House. But we must not permit our respect for the dead or our sympathy for a part of the living to lead us into an act of injustice to the balance of the living. I will not go into an argument to prove that Congress has no power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member upon this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give as much of our own money away as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate a dollar of the public money. I am the poorest man on this floor. I cannot vote for this bill, but I will give 1 week's pay to the object, and if every member of Congress will do the same, it will amount to more than the bill asks." Well, the bill was defeated. It doesn't give a record of how many members of Congress gave their own money. A gentleman approached David Crockett and asked him why he would give a speech denying this poor lady the taxpayers' money. Crockett went on to tell this gentleman that years earlier there was a fire in Georgetown, and all of the members of Congress rushed to Georgetown to see it largely burned to the ground, and the very next day, out of sympathy for the suffering of the people of Georgetown, Congress took up a vote to spend $20,000 to relieve the suffering of the victims of the Georgetown fire. Right after that, and Crockett voted for that. Crockett went back out to Tennessee to run to start his campaign to be reelected when he ran across a farmer working in the dirt by the name of Horatio Bunce. He approached Mr. Bunce and said, "Well, friend, I am one of those unfortunate beings called candidates, and Mr. Bunce said, "Yes, I know, you are Colonel Crockett. I have seen you once before and voted for you the last time you were elected. I suppose you are out electioneering now, but you'd better not waste your time or mine. I shall not vote for you again." He said, "Though I live here in the backwoods and seldom go from home, I take the papers from Washington and read very carefully all the proceedings of Congress. My papers say last winter you voted for a bill to appropriate $20,000 to some sufferers by a fire in Georgetown. Is that true?" Davy Crockett said, "Well, my friend, I may as well own up. You've got me there. But certainly nobody will complain that a great and rich country like ours should give the insignificant sum of $20,000 to relieve its suffering women and children, particularly with a full and overflowing treasury. And I'm sure if you had been there, you would have done just as I did." And Horatio Bunce, a farmer working in the dirt, knowing more about the United States Constitution than probably 99.9% of all Americans living today, said to Davy Crockett, "It is not the amount, Colonel, that I complain of, it is the principle. In the first place, the government ought to have in the Treasury no more than enough for its legitimate purposes. But that has nothing to do with the question. The power of collecting and dispersing money at pleasure is the most dangerous power that can be entrusted to man, particularly under a system of collecting revenue by a tariff, which reaches every man in the country, no matter how poor he may be. And the poorer he is, the more he pays in proportion to his means. What is worse, it presses upon him without his knowledge where the weight centers, for there is not a man in the United States who can ever guess how much he pays to the government. So you see that while you are contributing to relieve one, you are drawing it from thousands who are even worse off than he. If you had the right to give anything, the amount was simply a matter of discretion with you, and you had as much right to give $20 million as $20,000. If you have the right to give to one, you have the right to give to all. And as the Constitution neither defines charity nor stipulates the amount, you are at liberty to give any and everything which you may believe or profess to believe as a charity, and to any amount you may think proper. You will very easily perceive what a wide door this would open for fraud and corruption and favoritism on the one hand, and for robbing the people on the other. No, Colonel, Congress has no right to give to charity. Individual members may give as much of their own money as they please, but they have no right to touch a dollar of the public money for public purposes." So Crockett, of course, then went back to Washington, and then the naval officer vote took place. In 1935, the constitutionally correct views of Madison, Crockett, Mr. Bunce were overturned, and our country has been different ever since. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932 promising the New Deal. The old deal from 1776 to 1932 was, you have to bear responsibility for yourself. You will have liberty. Government's authority is only to protect your right to life, liberty, and property. And should you fall in hard times, it still falls upon your responsibility, your church, your friend, your family, charity. But ultimately, the government has no right to intervene. Franklin Roosevelt intervening in the Great Depression, which, by the way, was caused by the government to begin with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, increases in income taxes on the top most productive workers from 25 to 63% under the Hoover administration. So a depression caused by flawed government policy. Now we have a different form of government, a socialistic form of government showing up to say, we're going to do these things in the name of charity to help people. Social Security, the beginning of welfare, minimum wage laws, and on and on. But Mr. Roosevelt ran into a significant problem. The Supreme Court kept ruling his New Deal programs unconstitutional. Imagine that. The Supreme Court saying, I don't know what you think you're doing. You can't take money from this one person to give it to them. It's very clear. And we have quotes to back it up. That began the discussion in Washington, D.C. in the Roosevelt administration that maybe the Supreme Court needed to change, that the makeup needed to change. And the discussion grew towards adding one Supreme Court justice for every residing justice that was 70 years of age or older. Out of the 9 on the bench, 6 of them were over the age of 70, and Roosevelt began serious discussions on adding 6 more. You can only imagine what the interview between Franklin Roosevelt and the prospective Supreme Court justices would have been. So, prospective Supreme Court justice, suppose legislation, we're not going to say which president just signed it, but suppose legislation came before you that allowed the government to use tax dollars, to say, create jobs for people building dams and highways. What do you suppose you might... Well, you can imagine the pressure on these 6 nominees to bow down to an expanded government. I mean, these people have egos. I mean, it'd be great to be a Supreme Court justice, but you're going to find the people that are sensitive to your agenda. So the Supreme Court, in the very next case that came before them that looked at yet another New Deal spending program, the United States versus Butler, the Supreme Court took up this act called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, an act that Roosevelt had signed to give government broader authority to help farmers when it doesn't rain or rains too much, whatever. Supreme Court looked at this proposal to take from one to give to farmers. And in January of 1936, the Supreme Court said, "The grant is that public funds may be appropriated to provide for the general welfare of the United States. Since the foundation of the nation, sharp differences of opinion have persisted as to the true interpretation of that phrase. Madison asserted that it amounted to no more than a reference to the other powers enumerated in the subsequent clauses of the same section. That, as the United States is a government of limited and enumerated powers, the grant of power to tax and spend for the general welfare must be confined to the enumerated legislative fields committed to the Congress." Hamilton, on the other hand, maintained the clause confers a power separate and distinct from those later enumerated, is not restricted in meaning by the grant of them, and Congress consequently has a substantive power to tax and to appropriate, limited only by the requirement that it should be exercised to provide for the general welfare of the United States. Each contention has had the support of those whose views are entitled to weight. Study of all these leads us to conclude that the reading by Mr. Justice Story, the Hamiltonian position, is the correct one. It results that the power of Congress to authorize expenditure of public monies for public purposes is not limited by the direct grants of legislative power found in the Constitution. The beginning of the end, if there's going to be an end for us, was right there. January 1936. Now think about what the Supreme Court did here. In an act of desperation to keep the Roosevelt administration at bay, to keep them from diluting the power of the Supreme Court with all these extra justices. Even though they had previously ruled that the General Welfare Clause did not allow for the taking of money of one to give to another. Now, all of a sudden, they go back and find the one founding father who no one agreed with in 1787 and side with him and call him the expert on what government can do with our money going forward. That is, if you ever sit down with your older students and have them rank the all-time worst Supreme Court decisions, Roe v. Wade, and then number 2, I would suggest, is this one. This one has put us in the position where we are today. Let's take a look at what has happened to government spending since that time. Spiked, of course, for World War II. World War II is interesting. It's actually, I tell my students how amazing. Here we have Great Depression, principally caused by bad government decisions, including the Federal Reserve Bank not doing its job. We go to World War II, and everybody sees that government planning won the war. And so when the war was over, and the people coming home during peace were in essence asked the question, do you want to go back to a limited government and free markets and not much regulation? Or do you want to trust that a government that can plan and win a war can now plan and win the peace? And the voters said, okay, go plan and win the peace. Now, a lot of people, this is where things get a little tougher for people, many of you in this room, to hear. I would do your students a favor and tell them that the Tea Party movement, which I'm excited about many aspects of it, it's about time that the Tea Party movement should have started when George Bush was president. Let's be honest. All President Obama is doing is trying to keep up with George Bush. The scope of democratic socialism that we have today is just a residual effect of Republican socialism that we got for 8 years in the category of government spending under George Bush. Setting aside Department of Homeland Security, the war on terror, the war in Iraq, setting that spending aside, government spending for domestic social welfare programs under George W. Bush increased by the largest amount since Lyndon Baines Johnson. I do not miss Bill Clinton for many reasons, but I wish Bush would have acted more like him in this one respect. At least the last 6 years of Clinton, if we're honest, the rate at which government spending grew was vastly smaller than it was under George W. Bush. He did not use his veto on any spending bill for his first 5 years in office. He's the first president since the 1800s that in his first term could not find one spending bill by Congress that he thought was excessive. He signed every one of them. Under his watch, under the Bush years, 62% increase in spending for the Department of Education, a department that Ronald Reagan said should be abolished. And Ronald Reagan was absolutely right. Absolutely right. We talk about national health care today. The prescription drug benefit program that Mr. Bush, he said we're going to help all seniors pay for prescription drugs. $16.6 trillion unfunded liability going forward to pay for the prescription drugs of senior citizens, many of whom, not all, but many of whom will be sitting in their Mercedes at Walgreens, having taxpayers pay for their medicine, while poorer people behind them pay twice for their medicine and for the senior citizens' medicine through the force of government spending. This was signed and championed by the conservative George Bush. We had a huge increase in farm supports. Take a look at who gets farm supports in the United States of America. Mostly millionaire farmers, not poor ma and pa kettles struggling on their 19 acres in the middle of Iowa. Huge increases in the National Endowment for the Arts. And many of you homeschool parents knows exactly the type of art that this meant you were paying for during this period of time. And on we go. So here, now, we have President Bush gone. Now here we have President Obama coming into office. And it's accelerated into areas, well, the TARP bailout that began under Bush accelerated under Mr. Obama. The bailout of General Motors. Never mind for a moment that General Motors got into the position it got into by having bloated union contracts and products that people didn't want to buy. Honda didn't ask for a bailout. I wonder why that is. Maybe Honda is satisfying their customers. Maybe Honda is practicing better cost control. So General Motors goes under, and people who drive Fords now have to pay for their Ford and for the bailout. Why not, just as a footnote this, why not tell General Motors, look, you had a nice run for a while, but we are not going to begin the process of creating moral hazard. We're not going to signal other businesses out there that if we save you, we'll save them, because they'll end up being unproductive, irresponsible corporate thieves as well and not serve their fellow man. Whenever I write op-ed pieces for various newspapers, often I will get criticism from Christians who will say, "I am my brother's keeper. Therefore, the proper role of government is to aid the poor, widows, and orphans." Okay. Please have your students. This is a 76-page book written by a French economist by the name of Frédéric Bastiat. It's called The Law. You can get it for about, if you don't have them read anything else while they're in high school as it pertains to government, have them read this book. It's just called The Law, Frédéric Bastiat, B-A-S-T-I-A-T. He wrote it in 1849. Here's a sampling. And I use Bastiat often to respond to my Christian brothers about the nature of free will versus forced will. Bastiat says, "Life, faculties, production, in other words, individuality, liberty, property, this is man. And in spite of the cunning of artful political leaders, these three gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. Since an individual cannot lawfully use force against the person, liberty, or property of another individual, then the common force, for the same reason, cannot lawfully be used to destroy the person, liberty, or property of individuals or groups. The law has placed the collective force at the disposal of the unscrupulous who wish without risk to exploit the person, liberty, and property of others. It has converted plunder into a right. Finally, men naturally repel against the injustice of which they are victims. Thus, when plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter, by peaceful or revolutionary means, into the making of laws. According to their degree of enlightenment, these plundered classes may propose one of two entirely different purposes when they attempt to attain political power. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder, or they may wish to share in it. Woe to the nation when this latter purpose prevails among the mass victims of lawful plunder, when they in turn seize the power to make laws." Consider this for a moment. What if tonight I went across the street to public, or let's suppose tonight while some of you are getting on the shuttle buses, I jumped out of the bushes with a gun and robbed every fourth person and ran away with their wallet or their purse. Rob 100 people, collect a few $1,000s. But I go straight to Publix, to the pharmacy, with the money, and I wait for people who appear to be poor to show up to buy their medicine. And I stand there as they're getting their medicine, and when the pharmacist tells them how much, I hand them the money. So I don't keep any of it for myself. I will get arrested, and when it goes to trial, if I stand in front of the judge and say, "Your Honor, look, Mr. Obama's health care legislation, most of it doesn't start till 2014. I'm just trying to get a jump start on the benevolence that he's pursuing, but has delayed to 2014. I didn't keep any of the money for myself. I gave all of it to my fellow man. I didn't hit anybody when I took their money. I just quickly ran away with the wallet. So I didn't really hurt anyone. And these people can't afford it. They're homeschool parents. They know how to handle a budget. It's a momentary setback. So, Your Honor, can't you see that I was just doing this out of love and consideration for my fellow man? I'll go to jail." Bastiat asks the question in his book, by what right do I have as an individual? What right do I have using my vote to do what as an individual would land me in jail? I mean, when you consider this for a moment, the idea of plunder, Well, we say, okay, but we live in the rule is you have to pay income tax. Okay, fine. Well, I want you to think about this for a moment. The President and Congress have to swear to defend the Constitution. Madison already told us what ain't in it. You can't do this. Now, I know Mr. Obama's fallback position would be, well, Butler versus, I can do it. And technically, he's correct. He is technically correct. The current law of the land is, Alexander Hamilton, do whatever you want to do. But are we to participate in a sin because it's legal to do so? If I fail to bear responsibilities to my wife and my children, if I don't manage my money correctly, is it right for me to go into the voting booth to vote myself the money of those people who have managed their lives correctly? Just because it's legal. Slavery used to be legal. There were ministers throughout the South that tried to defend and used the Bible to defend the gross violation of the natural, God-given rights of black people who were forced. Did the law making slavery legal, did that make it right? Of course not. It doesn't make it any more right that we would turn to the government to do those things that we should be doing on our own. Before I conclude with Mr. Bunce once again, I want to run some things by you that if your kids are sharp, this will come up. If what you're hearing you perceive to be true, and again, I didn't invent, I'm just telling you, this is what the Constitution says, this is what the rule book is supposed to be, and you can draw your own conclusions, okay? Either we have a rule book or we don't. But your students will ask you other questions. Other than can government take from one to give to another for charity, they might also ask you this. They'll say, well, listen, I heard that the government is going to spend X number of billions of dollars as a stimulus package to help jumpstart the economy. And all of you know, what, about a year or so ago, $787 billion, not of current taxpayer dollars, but of our children's and grandchildren's taxpayer dollars, were appropriated as part of a stimulus package to get the unemployment rate down to our wonderful 10% mark right now. It's really been a wonderful stimulus package, and the economy is just bursting at the seams. So, now that this idea of government engaging in a stimulus spending reminds me, going back to Bastiat, when Bastiat was an economist in France, during one of France's recessions, there was an economics minister there in France that recommended that the government hire teenage boys to go around throwing rocks through windows to get France out of a recession. The idea being that if we break windows, somebody's got to come back, and there'll be money, there are jobs created in making a new window, money for the glazer, money for the painter. And Bastiat called this the broken window fallacy. He said that while the shopkeeper is there looking at his window and somebody tells them, look, this will help, we're going to spend this, we're going to stimulate the economy by having government hire these people, at best, it's the zero-sum game. A $50 window is gone, a $50 window is put back, zero, nothing. At worst, for those of you who have ever heard of an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, he was the British economist who Hitler and Roosevelt loved for the idea of government taking over business and massive spending. John Maynard Keynes argued that for every dollar the government spends on stimulus projects, the gross domestic product will go up by more than $1. It's called the multiplier effect. And Mr. Obama, his economists reached the conclusion that the $787 billion stimulus package was going to have a multiplier effect of 1.5. That 787 times 1.5, that would be by how much? So the GDP was going to go up by more than $1 trillion, fix the economy. Okay, $787 billion taken by force from the taxpayers for the government to spend it presupposes that the government knows best what to spend the money on. If government knew best what to spend money on, the Soviet Union would be the greatest economy that ever existed on the face of the earth, and rafts would currently be heading from Miami to Cuba. Government spending doesn't achieve these things. Think about this for a moment. I tell my students, the big difference between you spending your $7.87 and the government spending your $7.80, I can't say $787 billion because they can't even understand that big of a number, is this: motivation and consequences. We are motivated when we make a spending decision to maximize the benefits we will get as individuals or for our businesses. Because there are consequences if we make bad decisions with our money. Consequences for our business, consequences for our family. And it can be measured in profits and losses and deficits and debt and all these other problems. What is the motivation of government but to gain votes? When Ted Stevens from Alaska proposed the $454 million bridge to an island with 50 residents, ask yourself, would Disney spend $454 million to build a bridge so 50 people could get to the park? No way. But Disney shareholders and bondholders would rake Disney over the coals for being irresponsible with money. But when the government does it, the motivation is to gain political favor, and the consequences are none. After every failure, what happens? The government realizes how it made the mistake, and the reason it made the mistake is because its agency isn't big enough, and it doesn't have enough workers, and so all that happens every time government blows it, because it's not for profit, is that the government gets even bigger at your expense. So this stimulus of $787 billion, I should point out, no economist since the existence of John Maynard Keynes has ever been able to prove that government spending has a multiplier effect. It didn't show up in the space program, the interstate highways of the 1950s. Not one example, because when you deduct $787 billion from the private sector, this is money that we would have used, and the rate of return from us using it pursuant to our own interests is guaranteed to be higher than any rate of return by government because of motivation and consequences. Is it any wonder that all we've seen so far, well, look at the Wall Street Journal today. They're talking about another $190 billion stimulus package because the other one, hasn't quite, and unemployment isn't going down by as much as, so this time it really, really will work, we promise. You've got to be kidding me. And next time if your children say, well, I think stimulus spending will work, grab $20 out of your kids' hands and say, okay, I'll spend your money on something for me, and we'll see if that stimulates your private economy. Then they might get the idea. Some of your friends will tell your students, hey, war is good for the economy. If I had $1 for every time I've heard this fallacious statement, war is good for the economy. And everybody likes to point to World War II. Unemployment fell from to 1.2%. The GDP increased dramatically, and it appeared that government got us out of the Great Depression. First of all, unemployment fell to 1.2% because we drafted 10 million men, took them out of the labor force, and they weren't counted as unemployed anymore. That's a big help. When you take people out of the labor force by force, that can lower any unemployment rate. If we were to draft 10 million people today and send them over to, Argentina just to stand there for a while, our unemployment rate would go down again. I don't know if that's a good economics model for how we grow as a country, but that's the biggest reason for the drop in unemployment. Number two, when you look at the gross domestic product for the United States during World War II, consumption fell dramatically. You guys remember the stories from your grandparents on the rationing books? Illegal to drive, illegal to buy tires, illegal to buy cars, illegal to buy gas for pleasure driving. You had to get government permission to get sugar and all these other products. Consumer spending fell dramatically. Private investment spending fell dramatically. Net exports fell dramatically. The only reason the gross domestic product went up during the war from government spending is because government spending grew so much that it offset the collapse of the private sector economy. But again, who wants to return to a command and control economy with ration books and the government monitoring everything we buy? Finally, war is good for the economy. Tell that to the 55 million people who died during World War II. Think about this for a moment. If those 55 people, 20 million in the Soviet Union, 405,000 here, 55 million people destroyed by government's decisions. If those 55 million people had been allowed to live, imagine the discounted present value of their income and wealth going forward. I'm quite certain it dwarfs any amount of money that we spent on those wars. Necessary war? Of course. But if war is good for the economy, our economy is so bad right now, maybe we should hope for 4 hurricanes in a row and an invasion of Mexico. That will destroy so much of Florida. We'll have to rebuild Florida. We'll have to spend all this money to invade Mexico. The economy would be wonderful if we could just get more destruction. Hurricane knocks the building down, you put it back. That's not a stimulus. That's just replacing broken windows. Finally, going back to Mr. Bunce. Horatio Bunce invited Davy Crockett for dinner that night. He chastised him and told him, "I'll never vote for you again." And this is what Crockett observed. He, Mr. Bunce, then opened the Bible and read the 23rd Psalm commencing, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," in a beautiful composition. And his manner of it is a beautiful composition, and his manner of reading it gave it new beauties. We then sang a hymn, and we all knelt down. He commenced to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven." No one who has not heard him pronounce those words can conceive how they thrilled through me, for I do not believe that they were ever pronounced by human lips as by him. I had heard them 1,000 times from the lips of preachers of every grade and denomination and by all sorts of professing Christians, until they had become words, of course, with me, but his enunciation gave them an import and a power of which I had never conceived. There was a grandeur of reverence, a depth of humility, a fullness of confidence, and an overflowing of love, which told that his Spirit was communing face to face with God. An overwhelming feeling of awe came over me, for I felt that it was the invisible presence of Jehovah. The whole prayer was grand in its simplicity, and the purity of the Spirit it breathed, in its faith, its truth, and its love. I have told you that he came nearer converting me religiously than I had ever been before. He did not make a very good Christian of me, as you know, but he has wrought upon my mind a conviction of the truth of Christianity, and upon my feelings of reverence for its purifying and elevating power, such as I'd never felt before. And I will tell you, sir, if everyone who professes to be a Christian lived and acted and enjoyed it as he does, the religion of Christ would take the world by storm. Now, I would encourage you to encourage your children going forward, not to be spiritually lazy and depend on the use of force to wrestle away someone else's money to help our neighbor, but to help them go back to what we're supposed to be about, a non-plunderous, giving people of our own free will, and a people that are supposed to encourage those that have sworn to defend the Constitution to go back and read it and begin the process of getting back to what it stands for. Thank you very much for your time.